And thank you for bearing with me because the Shabbos, the Sunday before, I had a simcha. I couldn't make the shiur, so we're really 3 weeks out. We were going to pick up from Yud Ches and Beis, but it's really kind of in the middle of the sugya. So in order to, since we're now hopefully going to have continuous weeks, I just want to revert back to Yud Ches Amud Aleph, Yud Ches Amud Aleph, the Mishnah. We can go over this for those of us who remember it, or it's a little dim. Let's go through this, and then we'll pick up where we left off on the bays, and it'll be a seamless connection. All right, so we started the new Mishnah on Yud Ches Amud Aleph, and the Mishnah said, "Motza gite noshim b'shchura avodim." If someone found a get or an emancipation document for a slave, daitiki, which we said was a deathbed will, which is different than a regular will, matanos, gifts, beshovrin, and receipts for either purchases or exchanges. Harizeh lo yachzir. If someone found them in the street, he should not return them. And by we return them, we assume the Mishnah typically means to the recipient. In other words, the woman of the get, the eved, or the recipient of a gift or whatever. We shouldn't return it. Why? Shani Omer, because in my mind, I can argue that a person gave them, there is no chazaka that he gave them, there's no certainty. So we say, if you found it, then maybe he didn't want to give it. So if you give it, it will be something that will be against his will. And we don't want to do that. Now, it's interesting because, and we're going to talk specifically about Gitei Noshim, and I'll explain why, is all of these events are events that maybe you can undo them, maybe you can't undo them, arguably. A get, because of the ramification of the get, if you give the get, first of all, the get really has to be given with kavana. In other words, you go, the sofer writes it, he writes it for that person, which is why we'll see later on if someone with the same name can't just pick up and say, oh, I got the same name, I'll use the get. I want to divorce my wife of the same name. It doesn't work that way because it has to be specific. And of course, the ramifications are tremendous because if it's not a proper get and a woman remarries, then you have all kinds of problems with an Eshes Ish. So a get is different than the others because it's almost irreversible. The others, maybe you can reverse, but you can't reverse once you have a get and the follow-up of the get, a remarriage or other things, then these are Isuri Deraisa. These are Torah, forbidden by the Torah. So therefore, in the best practice is not to give it. So we don't give it. Okay, fine. That's the Mishnah. Now, we said in the Gemara, Tama the Nimlach Shlo Nitten. The reason why. Now, this is not in the Mishnah. This is very important. The Mishnah ends, doesn't say anything more. The Gemara now, the Amoraim are extrapolating what the Mishnah means. Tama the Nimlach. The reason why you don't give it because it's not clear that he wanted to give it. Tama the Nimlach Shlo Nitten. Ha'oma tenu. But if he says tenu, you go to the guy, you go to the giver in all these instances, and he says, sure, give it. I meant to give it. Nosnin, va'afilu isman merubah. But if he says,
then I don't understand. What's the harm in going to the giver first? In other words, you're a good Samaritan. You're finding a get on the road, and you go to the writer of the get, and he says, "Oh," or you call him up, and he says, "Oh, thank you so much, but I don't want to give it," or he says, "Oh, thank you for finding it. By all means, pass it on to the recipient." He's going to tell you. So no harm done if you're always going to the writer.
True. So to your point, Chaim, that's exactly what's done. Or maybe you can't find the giver, or maybe the giver died, or he's not here anymore. In other words, you're right. It's an easy solution to go to the giver. And what the Gemara is extrapolating is it says, Tama the Nima, ha'oma tenu, but if you went to him,
oh, okay,
you took your advice, Chaim, and you went to the giver, and the giver says, give it.
Oh, then you always do what he said. Okay, I'm sorry.
Exactly. But you remember, depending on how long it took in the intervening time, the giver may not be around anymore. So you don't know what the intent was. So the first practice is don't give it.
Right.
Don't deliver it to the recipient. That's step one. Step two, as you say, try to
Yes.
find out, get the facts. If you can get the facts, good. If you can't get the facts, the status quo is you don't give it.
You also had many cases of the get was written before somebody had to go to war. And
Correct.
then
Getting that
really have
exactly right.
complications that there may not be an answer.
So is it
Exactly.
about to tell us what you do with it if you don't give it? If you can't find the writer?
You have to just rip it up. You have to destroy it because that document should no longer be an active document that can be cashed in. Right. So so the Gemara extrapolates that if you're going to go to the fellow, follow your advice, Chaim, and he says no snin, give it, you can give it even if it's 6 months later. Why? Because as long as the giver says okay, what's the harm? I mean, no one knew about this document, and it took all this time to find the giver, and he said, I meant to give it from the day one. So therefore, the Gemara extrapolates afilu zman meruba. Even if a long time has passed, it's still okay. That's our understanding of the Mishnah right now. Frank, the Gemara, Veramino, now we have a difficult question. We have a Beferish Mishnah in Gittin, Mevi get. Menu, if someone, a shaliach, brings a get, and the shaliach loses the get in the course of the delivery, says the Mishnah, Matzala alter, if he finds it right away, he misplaced it in his pocket, kosher. In lav, possible. Now, what is la'alter? So that the question is what's la'alter? But at least you see that there is a confining interpretation of what it means to lose it. Okay, so our Gemara extrapolated that you can do it even if it's Zaman Meruba, and Zaman Meruba could be any amount of time, a month, 2, 3, it doesn't matter. Meruba means a long time. And the Mishnah says la'alter, right away. In lav, posel. But if you don't find it la'alter, then that document is posel, and you can no longer use it. That's that Mishnah. It's a Beferish Mishnah. And okay, so you have to go with the Mishnah.
Excuse me, Rabbi, why if he finds it later, a couple of months, and you know that it's been totally in his possession the whole time, it hasn't left his possession, it should still be good.
But you don't know that it was in his possession.
He knows because he found it in a drawer in the house and nobody else.
No, he gave it to a shaliach. He gave it to a shaliach.
Shaliach found the shaliach misplaced it or something.
Misplaced it, right.
But if the shaliach knows that it was in his possession totally the whole time, it was in his bag or something that nobody else had access to, it should still be good.
Okay, so hold the thought, okay, and then let's talk about that after we learn, after Rashi explains a couple of things to us, then we're going to revisit that question. Okay, so l'chayra, you have a stira. One Mishnah says that only la'alter, and our Mishnah, which was silent, we explained the Mishnah means that there is no time frame. If the husband or the ex-husband, as it were, says tanu, it's good whenever you find it. That seems to be the position of our Mishnah, in which case it's a stira. It's a very straight forward conflict. Okay, so let's look at Rashi. Oma tanu. So what does it mean, Oma tanu? Achshav. Now that you found it, and you went back to him, as Chaim points out, you called him up on the phone or you visited him and he says, Tanu, give it. Nosnin, even though it was found a long time after when it fell, that's the big issue. Is it a different get, and therefore there's no kavanah to give the get, right? Maybe Yosef Leib and Chana in the get are the Yosef Leib and Chana of another couple who were getting divorced, and since it's not lishma, it's not specifically for her. That's the problem. So Jay, not in the case where the shaliach lost it in his house, but it got lost somewhere. and then you go down Lamberton and you find it at the corner of Lamberton and Lovejoy. Well, all of a sudden you find the get and you say, wait a minute, this is Yosef Leib and Chana. Sure, Yosef Leib and Chana lived off Rockbridge. I'll go ahead and I'll give him the get. But wait a minute, there's potentially another Yosef Leib and Chana. And how do you know if time passed that it isn't that other couple? That's the big question. And remember, we're talking about not the other. I pointed out, we're really talking about focusing on Gittin because of the ramifications. Now, lest you think that, okay, it's 98.9% correct that it would be the right people, that's not good enough. It has to be without any chashash, that it has to be 100%. Can you say with 100% certainty, as I sit here, that this is the get that was lost between this Yosef Leib and that Chana? You can't say it, I can't say it. And because it's not 100%, says the Gemara, problem. Go ahead, Jay, you have a question.
He lost continuous custody of the document.
That's the problem. And even in common law,
if you can't
common law,
prove,
in our law,
yeah,
that's very much an important issue.
if you can't prove continuous custody,
That's correct.
then you got a different ballgame.
Right. Don't we say Yale? Don't we say it has to be the chain of custody, right? You have to have the chain of custody, especially. I mean, we talk about that all the time in criminal matters. If you break that chain of custody, then there is a smidgen of doubt, not even a doubt, a smidgen. And yet we say, l'chayra, there isn't 100% certainty, and we require total borrower. You can go to sleep on it and not even have a doubt in your mind. Maybe you do with 99.999, but the point is that we're talking about a situation where the document was lost for who knows how long. Now, what's the problem? We're going to get to the problem in a minute, but the issue is that it wasn't. Now, says Rashi, Motzala Alter, there in the Gemara in Gittin in the Mishnah, if he found it right away, Meforish Kadesh Taber Shayara V'Tishra. What does it mean, La Alter? It means, nowadays, you'd have to draw a parallel. In those days, of course, we know that you had these maybe today it's the door-to-door salesman, or it would be this fellow. But in those days, if you lived in a town and you were isolated, you relied on these caravans or these salesmen, as there were, who were coming to town in groups, and they would be the people who would provide the commerce, right? Mekach Memker. And then, everybody went to the shuk, to the bazaar for 2-3 days, and then the caravan moved on to the next city. So he says, what is la'alter? In other words, there was a caravan and it moved on. There was a get. The get was lost. Before the next caravan comes in, you find it may be 3 days. But in other words, whatever was given, there was no possibility that someone from the outside made a switch. That's the key. The key is, if you're in your town and you're Yosef Leib Ben Chana, you're safe. But we worry that a caravan will come from Pumpadisa or from who knows where, come to town, and then you'll find the get, and maybe Yosef Leib and Chana were in Pumpadisa. And that's the get. So in other words, the doubt arises when there's a reason to worry that this get isn't local. So that's the ikar here. That's what alter means. It means traveling caravans in those days. That's where the whole issue of doubt arises. So that's what the Gemara means, that if it's la'alter, says the Mishnah, it's okay. But if it's not la'alter, then it's not okay. So now you have a kasha, you have a stira between the Mishnah in Gittin and our Mishnah. Says the Gemara Amar Rabbah. Rabbah says lo kasha. We do not have a kasha here at all because there's different circumstances. Kam b'makom she'ashiur is mitzuyos, kam b'makom she'en ashiur is mitzuyos. Now that we define the problem as these traveling caravans, and they're the ones who raise the doubt about what's going on with this document. So the Gemara in Gittin talks about traveling caravans, and therefore it has to be la'alter because the caravan is going to come and And there'll be a new possibility that Yosef Leib and Chana from Pumbedisa, that's the get, and it's not our get. But our Mishnah doesn't talk about traveling caravans. Our commissioner talks strictly local. We're in Kemp Mill, and it's all local. So therefore, who's worried? Who's worried? No one's worried yet. Now, again, if you had two Yosef Leib and Chana in Kemp Mill, okay, maybe. But there's one Yosef Leib and there's one Chana in Kemp Mill, and they're married. And now we find a get of Yosef Leib and Chana. Could it be anybody else? No. And that you could say with 100% certainty, because it's all in front of you. You have it here. There's no doubt. You know everybody here. You know them by name. You know that these two people are married, and you know there's nobody else by that couple name that are married. So you can't say it's their get, not my get. So that's a good answer. So Rabbah now distinguishes between, since Shiur Mitzvah, since the caravan issue is the key issue, one is with and one is without. Okay, Pasha Keret. So now we're very good. All of a sudden, Lo Kasha. Okay.
Rabbi,
Now,
can I interrupt a second, please?
yes.
I forgot to mention that at 1 o'clock today, we have the commemoration of the 11th yahrzeit of Rav Einenbach, Zecher Tzaddik Livrocha. It's on Zoom, so you have it or whatever, you can get it through the Shabbos shorts. I'm
Very
sorry
good.
for leaving
glad-
that out earlier.
No,
glad
it's
you
not
reminded
today.
us, yeah.
It's not today.
Tuesday.
Tuesday.
I'm sorry,
Oh,
Tuesday.
It's
Tuesday.
Okay.
Yeah, but I left it out. I mean, I'm sorry I left it out. I meant to say.
Yeah. Excellent.
Thank
Okay.
you. Thank you.
Now the Gemara goes weiter, and the Gemara says again, this is the Gemara speaking, not Rabbah. Rabbah makes his distinction. Now the Gemara is interpreting Rabbah, just like the Gemara before interpreted the Mishnah. And these are important, by the way, because as we go into the Gemara, we're going to understand some different things. There's a difference between if a Mishnah says something or a person says something, or whether the Mishnah says something and the Gemara extrapolates what the Mishnah means, or the Gemara extrapolates, like in this case, what Rabbah means. Rabbah only said there's a difference between caravans and non-caravans. Comes the Gemara and says, Rabbah, you just said that the distinction is traveling caravans. There's a further distinction. Even when there's traveling caravans, there has to be a second critical factor. There has to be two Yosef ben Shimon's and let's say Chana in that city. In other words, the reason why we worry when there are two caravans is because they brought a get from somewhere else. The Gemara says that's not sufficient. You can't just say because they came from somewhere else, that is the problem. The problem is they came from somewhere else, and we're muchzak. We know with certainty that there are two Yosef ben Shimon's and Chanas. That's the Gemara amplifying Rabbah. That's very, very important. Rabbah didn't say it. The Gemara says Rabbah has to mean it. Why, says the Gemara, because if you don't say this critical factor, the second factor of the chazaka of the names, kasha Rabbah ad Rabbah, we're going to have a conflict of two things that Rabbah said. We're going to see that in a minute. In other words, if you do not say that Rabbah meant to say that there are two factors that go into this. One is caravans, and second is certainty that there is another couple by the same name, right? If you don't say both, then there's going to be a problem. Now we're going to see what that problem is in a minute. Now says Rashi, Lav Rabbah Komasid. That's what I just said. Rabbah didn't say this. And the Gemara the Gemara tells us that he Amar Rabbah Mamacham Shiur Mitzvah Loy Amar Ela Kishahuchsu Kubir Achas Shenichta Bo Haget Shnaim Shishmoseim Shavim V'Shebis Neshosein Shavos. You have to say that Rabbah means, says the Gemara, that in addition to the traveling caravans, there was a certainty that there were two of the same couple in this, and you know that they were married. That's when the problem arises. Zok Rashi, the Elo Tema Hochi, the Rabba Tarti boy, that Rabba needs both. If you don't say that, Kasha the Rabba. Now we'll see the Kasha in a few minutes, but he's saying there will be a stira on Rabba if we don't say it. Okay, now we're going to go weiter and then we're going to see what the stira is. So now the Gemara introduces something to us which will be very important in our understanding of the Gemara. There was a get that came before the Bezdin of Rav Huna. Rav Huna was the Av Bezdin. He was the chief of the superior court of wherever they lived, and he was the chief judge. And in his courtroom there was a lot of gittin. Now, in his courtroom there came a get, Yavakosov Bey, Bishvira Masa the Al Rochis Nahara. There was a get that came, a shaliach brought it, and he brought it from a town called Shvire. Shvire was the town on the river Rachis. So that's where he came to deliver the get, right? And now he came in front of Rav Huna and he said, I lost my get. I came from afar and I lost the get and now I'm not able to deliver it. What should I do? Omar Rav Huna said, turn to Yud Chesam at base, Chashina Lishnei Shavire. Okay, we're afraid of two Shavire. Shavire was this town, and you can't deliver the get. Okay, so let's look at Rashi. At the bottom Rashi on Omid Aleph. Bei Dina de Rav Huna, he came to the courthouse of Rav Huna, the Macham Shu Yoshev, the Don, where he sat and paskin. We consider his courtroom to be a courtroom similar to where caravans come. Why? Because it was the central courtroom in the courthouse. Everybody convened there. If any of you have ever been to a courtroom, almost probably anywhere, and you go like on a Monday morning, it's a zoo. Because you've got lawyers and you've got defendants and you got witnesses and everybody's walking around and everybody's milling around. It certainly looks like a Shiuris Matsuyas, like a caravan that's coming through. So by definition, we're going to say that his courtroom was Shiuris Matsuyas, was a traveling caravan. Yeah, Chaim.
My understanding is that in small American towns, the reason it's called a circuit court is because a civil court used to come to town at a certain time in a caravan because you only had so many judges.
And they were riding circuit.
It was called a circuit court because it made a circuit. A court had let's say 5 towns that it serviced.
That's correct. That's correct. And Lahavdil, I don't remember this specifically. Maybe someone knows of it. More directly, is there used to be rabbonim, especially in rural areas, who used to ride circuit, and they went from town to, they may cover 5 towns, and they spent Shabbosim every week in a different town because they ran circuits. In other words, everything was done that way. Today, Baruch Hashem, we have, we're more developed, so people don't necessarily have to do that. Not courts, not rabbonim, but once upon a time, that was the only way.
Right, doctors also.
They used to make house calls and they used to have large territories to go to in the city.
I know my mom told me she lived in a town, Sigit, without electricity, and the doctor would come like once every 3 weeks. The doctor would hit that town.
Yeah, and absolutely. So this is the situation. So here in Rav Huna's courtroom, it was like a traveling caravan. Now, so now we have one ingredient. We have a caravan. We know we have a caravan in Rav Huna's courtroom. So what did Rav Huna say? Rav Huna said, "Chashina l'shnei shaviri." Says Rashi, "Chashina l'shnei shaviri." The top Rashi and Omid Beis. Afal pi shabo echad lefonenu. Even though someone comes in front of us, Omar, and he says, "Mimeni nofel," it fell from my pocket. I know that. Uploni hoyu mishalcha leishto. And Ploni, right? What do we call him here? What's his name? Yosef ben Shimon. And Yosef Shimon sent me. and I'm going to deliver this to his wife Chana to give her a divorce. Leishta. And we know that in Shviri there isn't another Yosef ben Shimon and Chana. We know that. Rav Huna goes to a different extreme. So he is now going beyond anything we've said to date. And he said, you know what? There may somewhere be another Shviri that we don't know about. And in that Shviri, there may be a Yosef ben Shimon and Chana. So in other words, Gittin is such and again, we talk about the extremity of the situation, Eish is Ish and Chas V'Sholom, Mamzerim and other things. You know what? We can't rest until we absolutely exclude the possibility that there isn't another Shviri. And by the way, the underlying reason for this is something we've said before. Remember, we've said in the past that when something is lost, there's a certain chashash, there's a certain an air of uncertainty. By definition, why would someone lose an important document? It's a get. How does someone lose a get? You have $100 bill in your pocket. You guard it like you would guard, the blue diamond. How would you possibly lose a get? So the teretz is, if you lost a get, now you have real concerns that maybe it's not a correct get because nobody loses a get. So the teretz is, says Rav Huna, I am from the extreme, and we're going to see later in the Gemara, we'll get to it, that Rav Huna has where to hang his hat. In other words, he's taking a very extreme position, but there is maybe a source for it. And so the Shnei Shviri. So now this is the situation. Okay, so Rav Huna parceled it and said, nope, I don't believe you, Shaliach, because maybe there's another Shviri. Okay, that's the situation. Now, we're going to go back to Rabbah. Rabbah was the one who introduced the teretz of the difference between Shiuris, Metzuyas, whether there's caravans or no caravans. Rav Chisda said to Rabbah, and Rabbah was, of course, the Gedolei of the Gedolei Hador, Puk ayin bo, investigate this carefully, says Rav Chisda to Rabbah. Why? Because in the evening, after the day is done, Rav Huna is going to come to you and ask you this shaila. He's going to bring up this case, and he's going to ask you, what is your thought about this case from Shviri, the case we just discussed. So he wants you to give him he'll want to discuss it with you. Nofik Dak. So Rabbah went ahead and investigated, and he found a source. What's the source? The source is a Mishnah that we're going to learn in a few weeks, and Chafam and Aleph. What does the Mishnah say? That Nan Kol Masa Bezin. We've already referred to this Mishnah before, previously, but it's from our Gemara. Kol Masa Bezin Harizeh Yachzir. Anytime you have an imprimatur from the Bezdin, where the Bezdin says, yes, we've reviewed this and it's okay, Harizeh Yachzir. Right? We had it in the context where a Malva and a Lova came before the court, and they basically had the handpick, right? They had the certification, right? They had a stamp that said everybody agrees. So later on, if it gets lost, the Lova can't say no, I didn't agree. Harizeh Yachzir. So Rabbah says this is a great source, because now I say a get. Why is this a great source? Because a get has to go to Bezdin. Once you have a get, it has to be established by Bezdin in order for it to be a valid get. Reuven can't just go to a sofa, write a get, and then say, now I'm going to go to my wife and divorce her. It has to all run through the Bezdin, and the Bezdin gives its approval, and then says, now you go deliver. So now he goes to the Shaliach. But since it's Masa Bezdin, then you can return it. You can give it back. What's the problem? So he's prepared to discuss this with Rav Huna, right? Now the Bezdin of Rav Huna, the Chimakim Shiuris Metzuyas. We already said that it was a place where caravans came, right? Because Poshet Rabbah, and Rabbah is going to tell Rav Huna the Yachzir that you can return it. Alma Ihuchsaku Shnei Yosef ben Shimon in Ilo Lo. So therefore, now we see that Rabbah's interpretation has to hang on whether or not we have a chazaka of two Yosef ben Shimons. Because if there is another Yosef ben Shimon, then you need to absolutely verify then you wouldn't return it, right? Lo. If there is no chazaka of no Yosef ben Shimon, so let's look at Rashi. Kol master bezdin is a yachzer. Kol milsa the also lebezdin lekayim. Anything that comes to before bezdin to establish the lekal mechesh the lenimach aleim shlo nitnan. Harizay yachzer, you can return it without a problem. You went to bezdin to make sure that it can be done. So according to this, 100% it can be done. So we see that Rabbah, notwithstanding the courtroom of Rav Huna being a caravan, right? It's not just where there's a caravan. There has to be a caravan and a chazaka of two Yosef ben Shimons. If there isn't a chazaka of two Yosef ben Shimons, then we're not worried. If there's two Yosef ben Shimons, then you can't return it. But if there's just a caravan and no chazaka of a second Yosef ben Shimon, you can return it. So this is going to be what Rabbah is going to tell Rav Huna. You, Rav Huna, are worried about the Shnei Shvirei. Don't be worried. Rav Huna, on the other hand, by the way, his answer is going to be, I understand, Rabbah, what you're saying. There's no chazak of a second Yosef ben Shimon, but I'm worried about a second Shvirei. I'm worried about something that you haven't even raised. You're raising about two Yosef ben Shimons, and if there's not another Yosef ben Shimon, I'm okay. But I'm saying there's another Shvirei where there's a Yosef ben Shimon. That's even more extreme. And that's going to come back for discussion later. But I just want to give you an idea that Rabbah is going to answer Rav Huna's kasha, and Rav Huna is going to tell him, yeah, Rabbah, you gave me a Mishnah that says Kol Masa Bezdin Yachzer. I'm fine with that. But that's as far as it goes. But what about another Shviri that you and I don't even know about? How can you give a get and make her no longer an Ashes Ish? Aren't you worried that there's another Shviri somewhere? Rabbah will say, no, I'm not. As long as I don't have a chazaka that there's another Yosef ben Shimon and Chana, I'm not worried. Rav Huna says, that's not enough for me. I have to know that there isn't another Shviri on a parallel universe somewhere that I don't know about, that all of a sudden came into play, and we don't know. Now, lest you say that it's so far-fetched, maybe it is, but we all know stories. We've heard stories about Gittin where there was a certainty, or let's call it near certainty, that someone perished, and then 20 years later, he comes walking through the door, right? Far and few between, but we know those stories. And this becomes a tremendous dilemma if a woman has remarried and all of a sudden her husband from the war, like you say, Jay, or from somewhere else, comes back, and there wasn't a Havamina that he was around.
Wasn't
and now
there
all
a
of a sudden she
story-
shows up.
Wasn't there a story with the Gedolim that refused to potter a woman when the husband was lost for 20 years or something? And then he just knew that he couldn't do it. And
Right, but-
because the husband showed up.
Right. And so this is the sad story of agunas who are not agunas because the husband doesn't want to give a get. They're agunas because they don't know if there is a
I
husband.
think Rabbi Hyatt referenced Moshe Feinstein even.
Yeah.
That,
Right.
I
that
think
he
that's
didn't-
what it
he
was.
just said no to a woman. He just said, I'm sorry, no.
Right.
Because the idea is that Hashem gives you the guidance. He kind of gives.
Right. Now, of course, the argument is that you should always find a way. So even Rav Moshe, who was a makel, Rav Moshe was known to be someone who would always find the silver lining and to do something.
Right.
At some point in time, you have to say, I can't find it.
I can't find it.
Right? I can't find the silver lining. I have to do the best. That's why, certainly, Rahmanis after the war, where people were lost, someone said, there were the stories of eyewitnesses that saw groups of people go into extermination camps, and they said, well, that person was from that city, that whole city or that whole town was liquidated. It wasn't an eyewitness, but there was a witness to a set of facts that almost seemed irrefutable. But what happened if that person escaped and wasn't in that group of people that went in? He saved himself. You want to give the benefit of the doubt and say that the woman, her husband surely died, but unless you saw it with your own eyes. Now there are people who were able to say, yeah, I saw Yosef ben Shimon, I saw Nabuch that he was killed. That's the reason why Rav Huna says, unless I can sleep at night knowing that there isn't even the remote possibility. So that's where he differs from Rabbah.
Right, Rabbi Grauman.
With
Yeah.
the Dakar submarine, the Israeli submarine that it took, they didn't find it for a long, long time, but they eventually found it. But I think the Rabbanim let the widows, remarry even earlier. But
Right. Now the case was it the case of was it Ilan Ramon? I mean, he was in a capsule. The capsule went up and it exploded.
Mhm.
Did we see him die? No.
No, but
we saw we knew he was in the capsule.
that was a chazaka. Yeah.
Right. We knew he was in the capsule, and the capsule exploded. Is there a possibility, a nest, that somehow he I mean, again, now you have to. What's the remote possibility that he survived such an accident? Those are the kinds of questions that really a Rabbanim weigh, and sometimes you're right. It's almost like it rises to the level of straining the mind. So in such a case, you would say, okay, I can be makel. I could know with virtual certainty, even though I didn't see the bullet pierce his body. I didn't see his dead body lying there, right? I didn't see him die. But we say that, yeah, he died. Okay.
Came up with 9/11 as well.
Hey, what, David?
Came up with 9/11 with the World Trade Center.
Absolutely came up with 9/11 for sure.
Rabbi Grauman, also, short of taking a census, frequently, also when it comes to for chazaka, like knowing that there's multiple people, has Beis Din going to be able to know that there are going to be people with multiple the same names? Also, it's especially if you're coming on a circuit, they don't have all the records of everybody's names in various areas unless they were able to have people come into Beis Din that they for sure have it. Most people, I hope that they wouldn't necessarily need to come into Beis Din just for getting or for whatever they had to, and even disputes that they would say, okay, we're okay over here. We don't need Beis Din to take care of us, and that's not on the record.
Right, which is why when Rabbi introduced this Shiur Mitzuyos back in the day, it was a very logical thing, because in your community here in our Dalet Amos in Kent Mill, we know there's one Yosef,
right,
one Chana, they're married, they want a divorce, okay. But once you introduce multiple communities, you're 100% right. But look what Rav Huna does. Rav Huna says, no, I'm with you. Okay, there was a caravan, and the caravan came, and okay, fine. But wait a minute, the caravan came, and you Rabbah, is saying that there has to be another element in this, meaning that you at least have to know there is a chazak of another Yosef ben Shimon. I can say, okay, so we check the caravan, they say we come from the town, even if they say, no, there's no Yosef ben Shimon in the town we came from. The last town we came from, there's no Yosef ben Shimon. So there's no, so that's fine. There's no chazak of another Yosef ben Shimon, but Rav Huna, in excess of caution and concern, says, but maybe you caravan don't know of another town by the same name that you didn't travel through, and somehow it made its way here. They can't refute him and say, we know with 100% certainty, 1,000% certainty, there's no other Shviri. We don't know of it, but it may exist. Maybe you come from Africa. No one knows anything about Africa, and Africa has towns, Yerushalayim and Baltimore and Shviri. Who knows? Again, is it extreme? Yes, it's extreme, but Rav Huna is being a machmir. Now, in that case, Rav Moshe might say, you know what? That is so far off the radar that we can be making. Maybe, I don't know, but maybe, because he doesn't hold that you have to go to the ends of the earth to see that there isn't another Shviri. As long as you know that caravan, where it came from, there's no chazaka, I can rely on that chazaka. And by the way, to the extent that we give heterim, even for agunas, that's how we arrive at that. We arrive at it because we have to be logical. Yeah, you can't be illogical. You have to have a certain logic to what you're doing. If the logic is clear that it's possibility the husband's around, he's around. If the logic dictates that it's illogical that he's around, now in the case of him missing, it's totally logical that he's around. We don't know, but is it logical that he's around? Yes, he was captured. There were people we read years ago that there were people who were on an island and they came out and they thought the war was still going on because they were all alone, right? Did we read about that number of years ago? And I said, how is that possible in the modern time? Because they were somewhere, there was no news, there was nothing. And they were still living 30, 40 years in the past. Not likely, but possible. So again, it's what strains the mind. Okay.
For some reason, it reminds me of the machlokas in the Mishnah between Rabbi Yehuda and the Chachamim that you get an extra wife ready before Yom Kippur when you're putting the Kohen Hagadol in the Lishkas Palhedrin, right?
Right.
And so mechinin lo ishto isha acheres in case the wife dies, because you have to have mechiper bado vad beso zu ishto.
Correct.
What if the wife dies? And the Chachamim shot down Rabbi Yehuda. They told him im kain ein la davar sof.
Right.
But so the answer is no. But when you think about it, you lived in a time of infectious diseases and viruses, and it was certainly in the realm of possibility that a wife was seriously ill and may succumb on Yom Kippur. But the Chachamim said, no, you have to draw a line. In kain ema davar sof. You're not going to get another wife ready. She's not going to die on Yom Kippur just when he has to do the avot.
So that's like the machlek. So those are like the machlekes Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai, whether you make a machmir, whether you say I go the extra step, and interestingly, this is not a machlekes Beis Shammai Beis Hillel. I'm just making the point that for our purposes, as we live, Beis Hillel is the correct psak, because we don't go to the ends of the earth to say maybe, right? Now, at some point in time, we're going to say that Beis Shammai may be the correct one, but for our purposes today, it's not Beis Shammai. So again, you have to draw a line somewhere and have to say what's logical. So the Chachamim, in their wisdom, have said we will try to be as practical as we can. And then you have, again, that's why you have Gedolim and have different in Europe. In the previous generations, there was these tremendous machlokes between rabbanim in towns that were famous about taking the position. Rabbi Yaakov Emden and I think it was Rabbi Yonatan Eibeshitz. I mean, they had, these were two gedolim, but yet they had differing views, just like you had with Rav Moshe and many of the gedolim on some of the things that he passed, which were very controversial, because he felt that that was the way to go.
Now, the rabbi, the issue of what is another Yosef ben Shimon comes up repeatedly, but they don't seem to bring up the question whether there's a Chana, another Chanukah. So is it the
because Rashi always says in the context, Rashi always brings down, like Rashi said in Amud Aleph, Ushmos Nesheseyem Shavos. We're talking about the men. Yeah, we're focused on the men, but Rashi makes it clear that what we're really referring to is the couples, that it's not just Yosef ben Shimon, it's Yosef ben Shimon and the same wife, because he says, Ushmos Neshosehen Shavos. So we're always talking about a parallel of a husband and a wife with the same names. Now, that makes it, you're right, David, that may make it less, even more distant that happens. How many times will you have a Yosef ben Shimon with a Chana? You may have Yosef ben Shimon's plenty, but how many times will it be the same Yosef ben Shimon and a Chana? That makes it even more difficult, right? Because it's less likely that will happen. But anyway, that's the case. So this Gemara answers the question on Amud Aleph when we were saying that if we didn't say it, there would be a stira in Rabbah. Now you see what the stira is. The stira is that if we held that it's just a caravan, then Rabbah, there would be a stira. In one case, he says yes. In one case, he says no. But in our case, if you say that you need two criterion, you need caravans and a chazaka, then we say fine. If you have both, then you can't return it. If you have only one, and now the Gemara is going to tell us very shortly what happens if you have differing ones. Okay, we'll see that in a minute. But you have to have both. Now, so then the Gemara goes weiter and says, "Bahugita dishtaka." I'm sorry, Ovid Rabba Uvda Rabbah himself was an Av Bezdin. Rabbah himself was a judge. He had a case, but who gita the Shtachach be Kisna the Pumbedisa, Kishmaitza. He had a get that was brought to him in Pumbedisa, and he paskined like his view, right? So what was his view? His view is that you need two things in order to say that the get can't be returned. You need caravans or the equivalent, or you need chazaka, the chazaka of the names. Okay, so now there's two views of that Gemara. And what happened? It was a house of flax. It's a place where they made flax. Okay, some say that case happened in a place where they sold flax. It was a store. It was like a retail store where they sold flax. In other words, in a house of flax, you have a lot of people coming. So you do have a caravan type effect because people come and buy. But there was no chazaka of another Yosef ben Shimon. Therefore, Rabbah said you can give the get. That's what he means, kishmaitza, like he paskins, that you can give the get. Ve'ikeh de amrei, and others say, hechet de Torah kisna, not where you sold flax, but where you work the flax. All right, you have to soak it, you have to clean it, you have to separate it. So it was the factory. It was the factory. Even though there was a chazaka of a second Yosef ben Shimon in Chana, but the loshchicha shiuris, a factory is not a caravan. A store is a caravan. So he held that a store where people come and go, that can be considered a caravan. But who goes to a factory? Yeah, a few people come and go and they want to see what's going on over there. But that's not shiuris. That's not a thoroughfare which can be considered a caravan. So the Iked Amri, these two interpretations, what does it come to show us? That differing views of what happened there, but the bottom line is you need both. So in one case you had caravans but no chazaka. In the other case you had chazaka but no caravans. So Rabbah says if you don't have both, you don't have anything. In other words, there is no stira. There is no you can't deny the get because you don't have both factors. Okay, so now so right now we're still good. Okay, we understand Rabbah, we understand everything going on. Now let's okay, we're almost at 11. Do we have a few more minutes or do we stop here? Because the Gemara now is going to introduce the next step. I think this is actually where we got to before Yom Tov, where we were going to pick up, but you can't pick up just here in the middle without understanding this whole Gemara. So we went over it carefully. We understand the whole Gemara, and so the maybe we'll stop here because we're going to go further. What we're going to talk about here is Rav Zera. Rav Zera is the one who has a kasha. And by the way, what's important is that Rav Huna, the whole interpretation of Rav Huna comes from Rav Zera. This Rav Zera that we're going to talk about, his understanding is what gives Rav Huna the position of worrying about another shvire, because that's really out of the realm. No one really believes that there is another shviri, but because of the excess of caution, he comes ahead and says that there is another shviri. So, okay, let's start this a minute. Rav Zera Rami Misnissen Abraisa. So Rav Zera asks a kasha from our Mishnah on a Braisa Umishana, and he answers it. So Rabbah, we know the kasha is from our Mishnah to the Mishnah in Gittin, right? The Mishnah in Gittin that says maybe get only the altar, and our Mishnah which extrapolates and says no. So Rabbah gave an answer to the stira between our Mishnah and that Mishnah. Rav Zera wants to say there's a kasha from the Mishnah in Gittin, not on our Mishnah, but on a Braisa. So let's just start for a minute. Rav Zera Rami Misnissen a Braisa. He asked the kasha from our Mishnah to a brisa, umishani. What's the stira? Tanan, we learned in the Mishnah, this is the Mishnah in Gittin, which we talked about, maybe get for Ovid Haimenu, if the Shaliach brought a get and he lost it, Motzal alter kosher, V'imlav posel. If he found it right away, then it's okay. If not, it's posel. And we said right away means that there was no caravans that came. So that's our Mishnah. The Raminu says, Rav Zera, I'm going to ask you a kasha from a brisa. The brisa says, Motza get isha b'shuk. If someone was walking in the marketplace, a Machane Yehuda, and he finds a get lying on the floor in the busy shuk, Bisman shahabal modeh, like you said, Chayin, you go to the Baal and say, wait a minute, your name is on this. Is this your get? And he says, sure, I gave it to her. Then Yachzir leisha, you give it to the wife. Ein a Baal modeh. If the Baal says, what are you talking about? I never gave this get. Then lo Yachzir lo lazeh, v'lo lazeh. You ask the kasha, what do you do with it? Right? Didn't you ask the kasha, what do you do with it? Or Jay, you may have asked the same question. What do you do with the get? Okay. Says the Gemara, lo yachzer lo lazeh v'lo lazeh. You don't return it to either party.
Well, meaning
Now,
you destroy it. You
you have to
essentially
destroy it. But the kasha is why? Why do you have to destroy it? So, here's the pshat. If the husband says maida, it's a good get, you give it to her. Everything fine. If he says no, look what can happen. You don't want to give it to the husband because maybe the husband gave the get. And remember, we learned about the cases where there was no ksuba. There was no ksuba. The get takes the place of the ksuba. How does that work? Well, she comes to collect her ksuba and he says, okay, give me the get back. Let me tear it up or give me the get so we'll know that you collected the ksuba. So he's going to say, the husband will say, he's a devious guy. He's going to say, sure, I gave her the get, right? But give it back to me because she collected the ksuba. I gave her the ksuba and I lost the get after she gave it back to me. And the teretz is, never happened. Never happened. So he is going to cheat her out of a ksuba because you're going to give him back the get. So you can't give it to him. Now, what about giving it to the wife? Well, the husband says, I never gave the get. If he didn't give the get, and there's a chashash, if the get's a kosher get, how can you let her keep the get and become an eishes ish on a get that is ambiguous? You don't know if it's a real get. Therefore, the Gemara says, when he says, no, I didn't, you can't give it to either one, because either case, there may be something going on here that we don't want to have happen. Okay, Lola's evident. Zok the Gemara, Katani Mias, let's understand. Bisman shahabal modeh, yachsel isha, when the husband is modeh, you do give it to the wife, va'afil zman meruba, even after a long time, right? Because the husband said, yes, it's my get. So we're not worried about time. If he admits it and says it's my get, you're not worried. So that's a stira. Our Mishnah says it has to, right? The Mishnah in Gittin says it has to be la'alter, and if it's not la'alter, you can't do it. This brisa, right? The brisa seems to say that if you go to the husband and he's maida and he says, yes, I gave the get, you give it back, even if it's a month, 2 months. That's a stira. Just like we asked on Rabbah, is a stira. And what did Rabbah say? Oh, it's a difference between caravans and non-caravans. What are you going to say here? What are you going to say here? That's the kasha. But Umishane, he answered it right away. One, so now the answer of Misharis Mitzuyos makes sense, because if the caravans come right away, then you know what? If you didn't give it back immediately, the caravans came. Now it could be from somewhere else. But if the caravans didn't come, you can give it back. But at least he's saying that the stira between the Mishnah and the Brisa can be answered. So this, now we have the same machlokes. So listen to this. So now one version of Rab Zera is those who say that when you give it back only when you have a chazaka that there's not two Yosef ben Shimons behind the Rabbah. That's the same position of Rabbah. Rabbah says you need two criterion. You need chazaka and you need shiuris mitzuyas. So Rav Zera says, I agree. Okay, the Ikeda Amri, those who interpret Rav Zera says yes, but Ikeda Amra Afag Abdullah Huchzav, even though there's no chazaka, there's only caravans, lo neder, you don't return it. Upliga de Rabbah. Now he argues on Rabbah, because Rabbah says you must have two, and in this Ikeda Amri, in this interpretation of Rav Zera, one version says that you had only the shiuris and not the chazaka, and the other says no. Even if you only had one, you don't return it. Upliga Rabbah. So there's another version in Rav Zera which argues on Rabbah, and Rabbah and Rav Zera don't agree. But again, it's an Ikeda Amri. In other words, there's two interpretations in what Rav Zera means in his case of the brisa, of the stira between the Mishnah and the brisa. And he says, in one case, it's like Rabbah. In one case, it's not like Rabbah. Says the Gemara, Bishloimer Rabbah, Lo'omak Rav Zera, Misnissen, Alime Leilak Shuye. Bishloimer Rabbah, who doesn't hold like Rav Zera, and he says, what does he say? There's a stira from our Mishnah here on Daf Yud Chesam and Aleph, and the Mishnah in Gittin, Alime Leilak Shuye. We want to. When you look at a machlokes, this is generally in the Gemara, and the machlokes appears several different places. When you articulate the machlokes, you want to articulate it in the highest and best way that you can. That's the general rule. So, I mean, as an aside, if Abaye and Rava have a machlokes, and Abaye and Rava are world famous, and that same machlokes is between, let's just say, Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shimon, as an example. I'm just making it up. And Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Shimon are several layers below Abaye and Rava. If you were to quote the machlokes, which machlokes would you quote? Abaye and Rava, because Abaye and Rava are the highest and best source for the machlokes. You wouldn't quote two, let's say, Amoraim, who are important, but they don't rise to the stature of Abaye and Rava. So you always go with the best. Shrek the Gemara, Bishloimer Rabbah, Lo Omak Rav Zera. The reason why Rabbah doesn't use Rav Zera's example of a machlokes between the Mishnah and the Brisa, because you always want to articulate the machlokes on the highest level. What's the highest level? One Mishnah against another Mishnah. Remember, in the pecking order, Rabbi Yehuda Anasi created the Mishnayos, and then he stopped. There was no more Mishnayos. There were plenty of other worthy sayings and discussions in the time of the Tanoim. What happened to those? Those became brises. Now we know that's a brisa. A brisa is something that was discussed between Tanoim, but didn't make it to Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi's. In other words, what's the expression? It was left on the cutting room floor. So it's important, it's very important, but it didn't make it into the Mishnah. So Rabbah, when he discusses the machlokes, this is more esoteric, by the way. So Rabbah wants to discuss two Mishnayos that are machlokes because that's the highest and best. You can't get better than two Mishnayos that are at odds. So he quotes it. Rav Zera, on the other hand, quotes a kasha between a Mishnah and a Brisa. Now, Rav Zera is no slouch, but at the same time, why is he quoting a Brisa when he can quote a Mishnah? Right? Why is he quoting a Brisa, which, and Rashi will tell us, Rabbi Hyatt, who was the Talmud Muvik of Rabbi Yehuda Anasi, he picked up after Rabbi Yehuda Anasi finished the Mishnayos. Rabbi Hyatt took all of the rest of the worthy sayings and he put it into a seder of brises. Okay, but it wasn't the Mishnah. So says the Gemara, I'd rather talk about a Mishnah. El Rav Zera, my tamal omakaraba. The bigger question is, why didn't Rav Zera use the same examples as Rabbah, two Mishnahs? Why did he go to a brisa? Rav Zera was Rav Zera. He knew the Mishnahs. Why didn't he say, I'm on all fours with Rabbah? You have one Mishnah in Gittin, you have a Mishnah in Bava Metzia, Daf Yud Chesam and Aleph. They're at odds with each other. Here's the kasha. He didn't do that. Why didn't he do it? This is what's critical. Omalach. Okay, with this we'll finish. Omalach. So he says, Mi katani ha'oma tnu nosnan vafilas maruba. Now we have to go back to our Gemara. Let's just flip back for a minute to the Gemara on Yud Chesam and Aleph. And we emphasize this in the very beginning of our discussion today. Remember, I said that the Mishnah ends and says that maybe he changed his mind. Comes the Gemara and says, you know what the Mishnah means? The Mishnah means, like you said, Chaim, well, because we don't know. But if we do know, because we went to him, we called him up, we went to his house, and he said, Tanu, give it to her. Afilas mambaruba. So how do we know that? Because the Gemara tells us that that's what the Mishnah means. Yeah. That if you go to the giver, to the husband, and he says Tanu, then it's okay. Says Rab Zera. Now go back to our Gemara. Ela Rab Zera, my Tola Makaraba, Omalach, Mikatoni Ha'oma Tanu Nosnan, Bafilas Mamaruba. How do you know? How do you know that it means Zman Maruba? Dilma Ha Oma Tanu Nosnan will all get a camel on the altar. How do you know that when the Mishnah says Tanu, that it means Tanu after a long time? In other words, the kasha is, why is Rab Zera not learning the stira from one Mishnah to another Mishnah? You know why? Because that Mishnah doesn't tell us what you say it tells us. You're telling me, Rabbah, that the Mishnah means Tanu, give it to him even after a long time. How do you know that? I mean, you're not making it up, but you don't know it. You're assuming that's what it means, right? I, on the other hand, Rab Zera, take a look at the Brisa. The Brisa says, Motza get Isha B'shuk. If you find a get of a woman in a marketplace in Machane Yehuda, Bisman Shehabal Modeh Yachzir. It's spelled out in absolute words. The Brisa says, if you go to the husband and he says, Yachzir, Modeh, you return it. There, I can extrapolate it means after a long time, because you went to the husband and you asked him. Our Mishnah doesn't say that. The Gemara says that that's what the Mishnah means. So you hear what Rab Zera is saying. It's a Gevaldig Gezach. Rab Zera is saying, even though we should learn the machlokes from one Mishnah to another, because the klal is that you always go to the highest level, and that's where you want to learn. And that's for us to understand, as we learned today, that's always the best thing. Go to the source. If you want to understand the machlokes, don't go to the Amaroim, go to the Tanoim. The Tanoim had a machlokes. Let's understand. So a brisa is not quite, I mean, a brisa is no slouch. A brisa is a brisa. But why go to a brisa if Rabbi Yehuda Anasi didn't include it in the Mishnah? You know why we can't go to the Mishnah? Because the Mishnah never said it. So you understand that Rabbi Zera is saying to Rabbah, you extrapolated from the Gemara that that's what the Mishnah means. I have a brisa that says so, lock, stock, and barrel. The brisa says, Motza get Isha B'shuk, Bisman Shabal Modeh Yachzir. You have to extrapolate that from the Gemara in our Mishnah. I don't want to extrapolate. You hear how powerful this is. So this now doesn't go to the essence of what we've been talking about. It goes to the whole understanding of what it means, a Mishnah and a Brisa, and how important it is that in Rab Zera's mind, you have to have clarity. And if you have a machlokes between one Mishnah and another Mishnah, and one Mishnah isn't clear, then why is it a stira? Rabbah says, of course it's a stira, because Rabbah holds from it. But Rab Zera doesn't
need
hold
clarity because the first sentence, the first word in that Gemara is trying to put clarity on the Mishnah.
Into the Mishnah.
So that tells you the Mishnah was ambiguous. I mean,
Right. But the Brisa isn't ambiguous.
Right.
The Brisa is totally clear.
He's
So
taking
therefore-
exception with that Gemara's interpretation. The
Exactly.
Gemara jumps in and tells you what the Mishnah means. He's saying not so fast.
That's right. So Rab Zera says, since the Brisa tells me in so many words, I can say there's a machlokes between the Mishnah and the Brisa. Now, we're going to stop here. The Gemara will pick up and understand the roots of the machlokes between Reb Zera and Rabbah. That we still have to get to. But now we understand that that's the basic difference, is that Rabbah says, I can learn machlokes from one Mishnah to another Mishnah. And Reb Zera says, no, I have to learn it from a Brisa. So Rabbah says, I'm good. But Reb Zera says, I'm not good from the Mishnah. Therefore, I have to learn from Brisa. So let's just finish. Bishloim Rab. Okay, the Kishmaita. So we learned the Rashi's about the flax. We said, "Hecha the mezav nekista the Shiur Metzia sham lava veliknos v'lahadre mishum delo huchsa kishna Yosef ben Shimon be'ir shekasabo v'lo chashina loma yesh be'ir acher sheshma kazu." So this goes back to Rav Huna, which again we're going to talk about Rav Huna next week. So he doesn't hold that we worry about Rav Huna's concern way out there that there's another shviri somewhere in the universe. That we don't hold of. So therefore, if you have both of them, the chazaka and the shiuris mitzuyos, good. If you have one, not. And the other ikad armor says, hey, the Torah kisva, where they work the flax, right? B'mei hamishra nimtza haget, in that warehouse they found the get. Umay kishmaitza, what is shmaitza? Shehuchsu mishnei Yosef ben Shimon ba'oseir shenichnaba. 100% there was a second Yosef ben Shimon and Chana. The Achshaba, and we made it kosher. The B'makam Shenimtzabo will have a Shiuris Mitzuyas. So if there was no caravan, but there was two Yosef ben Shimons, we're not worried because this Yosef ben Shimon was the one that we're talking about here, right here now. Because there was no caravan, it had to be the local Yosef ben Shimon. Couldn't be the other Yosef ben Shimon that we're talking about. So he said, Bishloim Rabad on Mishinuya Arume, the Misnissen, the Begitten, Mishnah and Ezekiel, we understand it's Mishnah to Mishnah. Lo Amar Rab Zera, the Rama Misnis Nabraisa. He doesn't want to hold like Rab Zera, but Rab Zera, who holds the Misnissen Ilay Malay Shuye. So Rabbah says Mishum the he Iker, because it's the Iker between Mishnah and Mishnah. The Yesh Tamer, and there's a question. Right? When two Mishnahs contradict each other, the Torah Lachzer the Ilu Braisa Yeshloma Ein Iker Rabbi Loshana Rabchia Minayin Lo. His Talmud Rabchia was the one who made it. So Rabbi says, okay, Rabchia, that's fine. He's very good at big Talmud Chacham, but I don't want to go to what he said. I want to go to what Rabbi Yehuda Nosson said. But according to Reb Zera, no, it has to be the Olam Kidikaimalon Shenimsal Alter, the Imlav Posel, Shema Ena Shelzer, Avol Braisa, Lekad Shnoyahachi. They give him the ton of Bahade Yaksa the Isha, Havle Lefluge, Bain La Alter, Bain La Maruba. He's saying, okay, here you have it in so many words that there's a stira. Right? The Lodamil Misnissen, the Hosam Lo Yakzer Tana, Muduke Havadai Yakzer. We were medayik, right? We had to go extrapolate. Echad Amatanu, we given the lo Tana Yakzer Lo Havale Lefluge. So he's saying, it's no machlokes because you have to extrapolate. But when you have it in so many words, it's a good machlokes. So we're going to end here. But you see, the beauty of the discussion is that again, differences of opinion. You have Beshame Beit Hillel, Abaye Rava, right? But you understand the other side that Reb Zera wanted to understand it in its total clarity. He didn't want any ambiguity of lashon. Rabbah says the Mishnah can't mean anything but that. So that's the teretz. Now, Mitzvah, we're going to pick up from here and understand the actual root of the machlokes, why Reb Zera says what he says, and the source, and why Rabbah says. But for our purposes, we've answered the questions, and so basically, you have to have the two. That pretty much everybody agrees, except Rav Huna, who says no, that I have another concern, a concern that never came up to Rabbah in our time, and that is the concern that there may be another shviri, there may be a place that I don't know. Not that there's a chazaka or not a chazaka of the names. We don't even know, but we don't know what we don't know is really what Rav Huna is saying, and that's an extreme position. But we're going to see next week how Rav Huna hangs his hat, where he gets it from. Rav Huna didn't make it up. I mean, he's not, Rav Huna said there's got to be a reason for it. And Mitzvah Shem next week, we'll pick up and we'll see what the reason is.
Shkach, Rabbi.
Yeah,
Shkach.
Thank you.
okay.
Have a safe week.